In New Delhi, the midday heat made the pavement vibrate. An elderly man unrolled his prayer mat at the edge of the street, ignoring the noise of traffic and the hurried looks around him. He had barely lowered his forehead to the ground when a police officer approached, shouting, "Stop that, this isn't a place to pray." With a harsh shove, he knocked the old man down. The mat curled up, the crowd froze, but the man, his voice trembling, murmured only, "Allah sees even what pride tries to hide." And then the impossible happened. The ground trembled beneath everyone's feet, as if the earth itself had reacted to the insult. What the cameras recorded in that moment made all of India fall silent. Before continuing, make sure you're subscribed and tell in the comments which city you're watching from. His name was Abdul Rahim, 72 years old, a retired tailor who lived in the old neighborhood of Chandni Chowk in New Delhi. He lived alone in a small room, decorated only with an open Quran and a worn-out prayer mat. Every afternoon before Dur, he walked to the same spot on the sidewalk, where the sunlight slipped between power lines and the shadows of old bazaars. That was where he prayed, surrounded by honking horns and the scent of spices drifting from the markets. For him, that moment was sacred, a pause between chaos and the remembrance of Allah. The shopkeepers already knew him. Some offered him water, others watched him with curiosity. A young fruit seller mocked him from time to time. "Old man, you pray so much you'll end up talking straight to the sky." Abdul only smiled and replied gently, "Who speaks to the sky is never alone." That day the air felt heavier than usual. The heat made the air almost visible, trembling above the asphalt. Even so, he placed the mat on the ground, aligned his feet and began the takbir, indifferent to the stares, the laughter and the sound of engines. He did not know that this would be the day his patience would be tested, and the whole world would see the result. The sun pressed over New Delhi like a hammer. The dense air mixed dust, smoke and the unending noise of horns. Abdul adjusted his mat calmly, ignoring the chaos as the stream of pedestrians hurried past. Then a dark blue police car stopped by the curb. From it stepped Officer Rakesh Singh, a man with a stern expression and a harsh voice, known in the neighborhood for acting before thinking. He walked toward the elderly man with firm steps, his weapon hanging from its holster, and sweat sliding down his forehead. "Hey, get up, you're blocking the way," he shouted, pointing at the mat on the ground. Abdul stayed in position. His body bent slowly, his voice barely a whisper as he recited verses from Surah Al-Fatiha. The officer looked around, noticing some shopkeepers watching with concern. "Stubborn old man," he muttered, and kicked the mat. The fabric folded, lifting dust, but the old man did not move. People stopped. A fruit seller raised his phone. A boy, no older than 10, tugged at his mother's arm. "Mom, why is he yelling at someone who's praying?" The woman looked away, unable to answer. Rakesh stepped closer. "Do you hear me? I said stop." Abdul lifted his face slowly, his eyes calm, and replied, "Allah is witness to everything, son." Those words echoed in a strange way, short yet firm enough to silence the murmuring around them. For a moment the sound of horns seemed distant. The wind stopped and even the birds on the wires went quiet. The air grew heavy, hot, as if the street itself held its breath. A shopkeeper whispered, "He should have waited for the prayer to end." But the officer didn't wait. With a rough shove, he knocked the old man off balance. Abdul's body fell slowly, the mat dragging across the ground. The crowd stepped back, and at that exact moment, before anyone could say anything, a deep rumble rose from beneath the earth, cutting through the silence. Abdul's body hit the ground, the dull thud blending with the distant hum of traffic. The mat slid a few inches, folding under his arm as dust rose around them. The officer crossed his arms, panting, a smirk of contempt on his face. "Where is your guard now, old man?" A strange silence settled over the street. Some bystanders raised their phones, pointing their cameras with hesitation. The sound of shutters clicking echoed like small witnesses to something no one yet understood. Suddenly, the wind surged through the alley, lifting cloth, papers, and even a woman's scarf. Store banners began to slam against the walls, the noise turning deep, almost metallic. Birds resting on power lines burst into flight, releasing sharp cries that echoed down the street. A tea vendor dropped his tray, the glass cups shattering on the ground. The officer turned, confused, trying to understand what was happening. What is this?" he muttered, adjusting his hat as the wind pushed against it. Abdul, lying on his side, did not react to the chaos. His face remained serene, his lips moving with effort, forming words only those closest could hear. "Hasbi Allahu wa ni'mal wakil." Allah is sufficient for me, and He is the best protector. The air changed weight. The heat gave way to a sudden chill, sharp enough to raise goosebumps on everyone's skin. A woman covered her mouth and screamed, "Look at the ground!" The asphalt began to vibrate, softly, as if it were breathing. The vibration grew, a rhythmic pulse rising from the earth's depths. Storefront windows shook, the sound of glass straining filling the air. The officer staggered, trying to keep his balance. Abdul didn't move. Even lying down, his body seemed surrounded by an invisible calm. The wind formed spirals of dust around him, without touching him directly. A boy pointed, frightened. "Look, the mat isn't moving." Everyone saw it. While the ground shook beneath cars, poles, and people, the prayer mat remained perfectly still, stretched out as if held by something no one could see. The noise stopped as quickly as it began. The silence that followed was almost sacred. The officer looked at the old man and stepped back, his face pale. And in that brief instant between fear and disbelief, Lucknow understood. Something far beyond human strength had responded. The vibration intensified. Fruit stands wobbled, and mangoes and oranges rolled along the sidewalk as if fleeing from something invisible. A deep, crackling sound came from the asphalt, not like a fracture but like thunder rising from the earth's core. Pedestrians began screaming, running in all directions. Glass shattered in nearby windows, and a car parked only a few meters away slid on its own until it slammed into a power pole. The noise of horns gave way to hurried footsteps and mixed prayers. A vendor dropped a tray of boiling tea and fell to his knees, covering his face. "Subhanallah, what is happening?" Security cameras installed on the shops flickered with interference, but they kept recording, capturing everything in silence. The footage would later show what no one could explain. In the middle of the street, Abdul Rahim remained still, kneeling, his body serene, his prayer mat untouched. While everything around him shook, the small square of fabric beneath him did not move, as if the earth itself had chosen to spare him. Officer Rakesh Singh struggled to stay on his feet. His once steady eyes were now wide with terror. He leaned on the car and shouted to the others, "Get away from him, he's cursed!" But his voice trembled, swallowed by the growing roar rising from the ground. Suddenly, the wind shifted direction. The flags on storefronts spun in circles, and papers shot upward as if something were pulling the air from below. The rumble became a deep, continuous sound, almost like the earth itself was breathing. The officer tried to run toward the car, but tripped on a loose stone and fell to his knees. The impact knocked the breath out of him. He looked at the old man, and noticed that the air around Abdul seemed to shimmer, as if an invisible barrier, an absolute calm, surrounded that small space. At that moment, the midday adhan echoed from a nearby mosque. The sound from the loudspeakers cut through the air with clarity, blending with the distant rumble. Each word of the call to prayer seemed to pierce through the panic, reminding everyone of something greater. The officer, still kneeling, covered his face. The sound of Allahu Akbar made the vibrations weaken little by little until they stopped completely. The silence returned, but it was not the same as before. It was heavy, solemn, as if the city itself had bowed in reverence. A fabric vendor looked up at the sky, where thin clouds drifted in opposite directions, and whispered with a shaking voice, "Allah, is this a warning?" People began to approach Abdul, now sitting, still murmuring quiet prayers. Some helped him to his feet. The mat, surprisingly clean, did not have a single speck of dust. Across the street, a woman showed her phone to another vendor. The recorded video clearly showed the moment when the officer shoved the elderly man, and seconds later, the ground began to shake. People looked at one another, some crying, others speechless. The officer, pale, leaned against the car and stared at the old man, unable to speak. And as the adhan ended, the last echo of La ilaha illallah lingered in the air, leaving everyone with the feeling that what they had witnessed was not just a tremor, it was an answer. By nightfall, the video of the incident had already crossed borders. On Indian social media, hashtags like Jika Allah answered and Miracle in Delhi climbed among the top trending topics. People shared the clip showing the officer pushing the old man, and seconds later, the ground shaking. The footage spread through WhatsApp, reaching journalists, scholars, and religious leaders. Some called it coincidence, others a divine sign. At the city's seismic department, engineers reviewed data from the monitoring stations. After hours of analysis, they confirmed no tremor had been recorded in New Delhi or surrounding regions at that time. The official explanation suggested the event might have been caused by mild underground vibration, possibly from construction. But when technicians visited the site the next day, they found no excavation, no drilling equipment, not even within a 2-kilometer radius. The mystery only grew. Meanwhile, shopkeeper Ravi Mehta, owner of one of the stores facing the street, delivered the full security camera recording. The high-resolution footage clearly showed the officer pushing Abdul Rahim. A few seconds later, the ground around him began to tremble, but only within a visible circle in the frame. Cars farther away did not move. Water bottles on a store shelf shook by themselves, and Abdul's prayer mat stayed perfectly flat, not folding even once, as if glued to the ground. The chief engineer, after watching the footage, whispered almost voicelessly, "This defies any model of localized vibration. There is no technical explanation for a tremor restricted to 10 meters." The video was sent to local news outlets. Within hours, reporters crowded the neighborhood. Residents shared what they witnessed. "I felt the ground shake, but inside my store, nothing moved," said a woman. Another shopkeeper added, "It felt like the ground only wanted to push the officer away." As interviews continued, a group of Islamic scholars gathered at the nearby mosque. Among them was Imam Farid al-Nasr, a man respected by the community. He watched the footage in silence, then said softly, "Allah sends signs not to shame, but to remind. Whoever tries to silence the worship of a faithful servant awakens the power that upholds the earth itself." On the evening news, the video played repeatedly. Anchors tried to maintain a neutral tone, but the images spoke for themselves. At the exact moment the old man is pushed, a strange reflection appears in the footage, a golden light emerging above the mat, lasting less than 2 seconds, disappearing when the tremor stops. Some called it sunlight. Others called it something beyond understanding. While the country debated, Abdul remained at home unaware of the uproar. He didn't watch television. He spent his time in silence, making dhikr and reciting the Quran. When a journalist approached him, he answered calmly, "What happened wasn't meant to prove anything. It was only to remind that Allah never abandons those who call upon Him." That same night, the police department released a statement saying that Officer Rakesh Singh was being temporarily suspended for inappropriate conduct and violent behavior in public. The decision was met with applause both online and in the streets. Near midnight, another video went viral, a recording made by a tourist from a different angle. In it, you can see that during the tremor, Abdul Rahim doesn't even blink. The dust covering the storefronts doesn't touch him. It's as if an invisible wall protected him. At the end of the night, Imam Farid gave a brief statement to the press. "The earth is Allah's creation, and it obeys His command. When injustice steps upon it, even the ground moves." His words were repeated in thousands of posts. And as the city slept, a certainty spread. The event in Chandni Chowk would not be forgotten anytime soon, not by faith nor by science. The following morning rose heavy, but calm. The streets that had overflowed with crowds the day before were now covered in an almost reverent quiet. In front of Abdul Rahim's small house, dozens of people gathered, reporters, neighbors, religious leaders, and onlookers. The old man, seated under the shade of the fig tree in his yard, held a wooden rosary and repeated the words, "Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah." When the journalists approached him with microphones and cameras in hand, one of them asked anxiously, "Mr. Abdul, do you believe the tremor was a miracle, a punishment for the officer?" Abdul lifted his gaze, his eyes sunken, tired, yet serene. "Punishment? No. Allah does not punish for human pride. He responds with wisdom." The ground only reminded the man who sustains his steps. The words were simple, yet they sliced through the silence like a blade. No reporter managed to ask anything else for several seconds. The distant sound of adhan from nearby mosques seemed to give weight to his phrases. Meanwhile, at the central police station, Officer Rakesh Singh was giving his statement before his superiors. The recorded interview showed a shaken man, his uniform wrinkled, his voice trembling. "Sir, I felt the ground move before any noise. It was as if something alive was beneath my feet." One of the investigators asked coldly, "Do you confirm that you pushed the man?" Rakesh swallowed hard. "Yes, but I didn't mean to hurt him. I only wanted to move him away, but when he fell, I felt as if the earth pulled me." The officer listening to him couldn't hide his discomfort. In the report, he wrote only one sentence. "The suspect shows signs of trauma and spiritual guilt." Hours later, Rakesh's suspension was confirmed and made public. At the Fateh Puri Mosque, Imam Farid al-Nasr gathered hundreds of worshippers for the afternoon sermon. The heat didn't stop anyone from coming. The case had already spread across the country, and everyone wanted to hear the religious perspective. With a firm voice, the Imam stepped onto the pulpit and began. The Messenger of Allah said, "Whoever honors the prayer will be honored by Allah, but the one who interrupts it with disdain touches the boundary between the seen and the unseen, because the earth recognizes the name of its creator, even when man forgets it." His words echoed through the mosque, piercing the hearts of the faithful. Some cried quietly. Others simply looked at the ground, reflecting on their own actions. A young man stood at the back and asked with a trembling voice, "Sheikh, and the officer, what will become of him?" The Imam paused and replied, "If Allah awakened him with fear, then he has already blessed him, for there are hearts that only wake when the earth shakes." A wave of emotion swept through the mosque. Meanwhile, Abdul remained at home, away from cameras. A neighbor brought him a plate of dates and asked, "Aren't you angry with him?" The old man smiled. "Anger is for those who forget that forgiveness is also a form of worship." That night, the sermon's broadcast spread across social media, reaching millions of views. The most shared fragment was the moment when the Imam said, "Allah does not remain silent when his remembrance is mocked." His words appeared in newspapers, videos, radio programs, and on the lips of those who once mocked. And for the first time in many months, the streets of New Delhi seemed quieter at prayer time, as if even engines and human voices had decided, out of respect, to let Allah be heard. The sun was already leaning over New Delhi's rooftops when Rakesh Singh stepped outside for the first time since the incident. The uniform that once filled him with pride now weighed heavily on his shoulders. He walked slowly, eyes fixed on the ground, avoiding the curious looks that followed him through the alleys. The neighborhood felt smaller, the noise of the bazaars more distant, as if the world had shrunk since that day. He carried in his hands a small bag of dates, a simple gift yet full of remorse. His destination was the same spot where the ground had shaken in his memory, the intersection of Chandni Chowk in front of Ravi Mehta's fabric shop. There, among the dust and the murmur of prayers, was Abdul Rahim once again bent over his mat, softly reciting the Dur prayer. The scene, identical to the one days earlier, made the officer's heart race. For a moment, he wanted to turn back, but he couldn't run from what had haunted him since then, the memory of a ground that pulsed beneath his feet as if it had a soul. He waited for the prayer to end. When Abdul raised his hands for the taslim, Rakesh stepped forward, removed his cap and without a word, knelt down. The sound of the uniform's fabric brushing the asphalt broke the silence. People around them stopped to watch. "Forgive me, old man. I was blind." His voice faltered, thick with shame. Abdul looked down at him without surprise. He placed his wrinkled hand on the man's shoulder and answered softly, "Stand up, son. I forgave you the moment I fell." The words cut through Rakesh like a silent blow. He lifted his face, eyes filled with tears. "I felt something holding me that day, as if the ground had a soul. I swear I heard a sound, like a heartbeat coming from below." Abdul smiled gently. "The earth knows who bows before Allah and who defies him. That day it only witnessed what you did." The officer lowered his head, now crying openly. The tears mixed with the dust, leaving streaks across his sunburned face. The old man took a deep breath and continued, "Pride hardens the heart, but Allah is more merciful than He is just. He frightened you not to punish you, but to wake you." A small group approached, curious. The silence of the scene felt almost sacred. The sound of the wind lightly stirred the cloth of the market stalls, like an ancient song. Rakesh took something from his pocket, his police badge. He held it in his hands and said with a breaking voice, "Since that day I can't put this on without remembering the shove. Everything I learned feels small compared to what I saw." Abdul looked into his eyes, then learned something else. The uniform weighs less when the heart bows. Power is not yours when it's alone. The words sounded simple, but they carried the weight of truth. The officer nodded, breathing deeply. The shopkeepers watching began to approach, some bringing cups of water, others simply standing in respectful silence. A young man who had been filming discreetly lowered his phone. Abdul noticed and smiled. "Son, there are moments that don't need cameras. It's enough that repentance is seen by the angels." The officer then bowed slightly, not in submission to the man, but in respect for the faith he had witnessed. He stayed still for a few seconds, then stood up, wiping his tears. "I don't know how to pray like you, but I want to learn." Abdul held his hands firmly. Allah hears even those who don't yet know what to say. Start by giving thanks. That is already a prayer. The sound of the Asr Adhan began to echo from the nearest mosque. Worshippers stopped along the sidewalks, aligning themselves for the prayer. Abdul turned to the officer and said, "Come, prayer doesn't choose the place, only the willing heart." Rakesh nodded, breathing deeply. And at that simple crossroads, where pride had once shouted, now two men, an old tailor and a repentant officer, bowed side by side before the Creator. The ground remained steady, but everyone there knew, even in silence, it was listening. On the following Friday, the heat gave way to a gentle breeze over New Delhi. Jumu'ah was approaching, and the narrow streets around the Fatehpuri Mosque filled with worshippers. The sound of conversations, the scent of incense, and the shine of clean garments created an atmosphere of quiet expectation. Inside the mosque, Imam Farid al-Nasr adjusted the microphone. In front of him, the hall was packed. Shopkeepers, youths, elders, and even Officer Rakesh Singh, sitting discreetly in the last row without his uniform, his gaze lowered. The Imam began the sermon, his calm and steady voice echoing under the marble domes. Today we won't speak of theories, but of signs. Allah shows His strength even in things that seem small. A shove, a ground that moves, and a heart that awakens. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew whom he referred to. The cell phone cameras remained tucked away. No one dared record. That story was no longer just news. It had become testimony. The Imam continued, "Arrogance closes a man's ears, but repentance opens them to mercy." When someone attempts to interrupt a prayer, he does not strike only the servant, but challenges the one who hears him. The words flowed like waves, gentle and unrelenting. In one corner, Abdul Rahim listened silently. His face was peaceful, his hands on his rosary, his eyes moist. Across the room, Rakesh discreetly wiped tears from his cheeks, trying not to draw attention. The Imam paused briefly and said, "Whoever wishes to understand the power of Allah should look around. The ground doesn't need to shake. It is enough for the heart to incline." Right after those words, the muezzin climbed the minaret. The adhan began, strong and pure, filling the air like a wave of light. The sound spread through the open windows, blending with the murmur of a wind beginning to rise. Suddenly, a crackle. The Imam's microphone cut out for a moment. The ceiling lamps flickered, casting shifting shadows across the ancient columns. A soft gust moved through the hall, lifting the edges of prayer rugs and stirring the worshippers' garments. But no one was frightened. Some closed their eyes, others simply smiled, feeling the warm, gentle air pass through the mosque. It was as if the wind was answering once more, not with force but with tenderness. The Imam raised his hands and recited in a firm voice, without a microphone, without fear. Allah responds in many ways, sometimes with thunder, sometimes with wind, and sometimes with forgiveness. His words echoed through the hall, multiplied by the silence. When the wind faded, the air felt pure, almost perfumed, and in that moment everyone understood. The earth might have shaken days earlier, but the real tremor was happening now inside every heart that bowed with sincerity. The prayer began, rows aligned, and the congregation moved in perfect harmony, like a single body before the Creator. No sound except voices in supplication. No distraction except faith. Outside, the wind gently swept over the city, rustling flags and date palm leaves. To anyone watching, it looked like nothing more than a breeze, but to those inside the mosque, it was the same quiet, eternal sign that Allah still speaks, even when the world tries to silence Him. The days that followed turned New Delhi into a mirror of reflection. The video of the shove and the tremor continued circulating across social media, now subtitled in several languages. Christians, Hindus, Sikhs and Muslims all commented on the same moment. The instant when the old man remained still while the ground shook around him. It didn't matter the faith, everyone recognized there was something sacred in that moment. Television networks sought out Abdul Rahim countless times, offering interviews, awards, invitations, but he refused firmly. "What happened does not belong to me. It belongs to the one who allowed it to be seen." He continued his simple routine, waking before dawn, praying, drinking tea, and walking to the sidewalk where everything had happened. There, a small blue canopy now stood, set up by local shopkeepers to shield him from the sun. Over time, the place earned a new name. Residents began calling it the Prayer Corner. No car parked there anymore, no vendor shouted during the adhan. It was as if that patch of ground had become a living reminder of what respect means. With a light heart, Abdul began visiting neighborhood schools. He spoke to children about patience and faith. He showed them his rosary and said, "Each bead is a reminder that even silence can be a prayer." Teachers listened attentively. Some moved to tears. The old man didn't speak with eloquence, but with sincerity, and that was enough. The same shopkeepers who had once mocked him for praying in the street now helped maintain the space. They left bottles of fresh water, swept the ground before prayer times, and cared for the mat as if it were a treasure. One of them, Ravi Mehta, admitted one afternoon, "When the wind blew that day, I realized it wasn't the old man who was blocking traffic. It was us who were blind." Meanwhile, Rakesh Singh, the police officer, was becoming a different man. He temporarily left his post and began attending the Fatehpuri Mosque. In the first weeks, he sat in the back, watching in silence. Then, little by little, he began joining the prayer rows. His first ruku was shaky but sincere. The sound of Allahu Akbar made him cry like a child. A fellow officer saw him one morning and asked jokingly, "So, you've turned religious now, Rakesh?" He answered without hesitation, "The man I pushed taught me how to pray." The sentence spread among the police force, and even the most skeptical fell silent. The neighborhood was never the same again. With each new adhan, the noise of the bazaars stopped. Motorbikes shut off their engines, and even the birds seemed to quiet for a brief moment. People paused wherever they were, not out of fear, but out of respect. One day, a team from the local government visited the intersection to discuss traffic improvements. One engineer suggested removing the small canopy to widen the sidewalk, but a resident interrupted, "Don't touch this place. It's ground that learned to answer." The others agreed, and the project was archived. Abdul watched everything with a discreet smile. For him, the miracle wasn't in the tremor nor in the fame, but in the silent transformation of hearts. He often told those who came to thank him, "I did nothing. The wind only reminded everyone that Allah never sleeps." Over time, the prayer corner became a stop for travelers. Some left flowers, others simply closed their eyes for a moment. No one dared pass without reverence. At night, when the neighborhood grew quiet and the last adhan faded into the air, Abdul would sit in silence looking at the ground beneath his feet, and he would think to himself that sometimes Allah does not send thunder to correct a man, only a gentle tremor, just enough to awaken what still sleeps inside the soul. Months passed, and the intersection that had once been a place of laughter and pushing now seemed like an open-air sanctuary. Old Abdul Rahim followed his routine with the same calm as always, the prayer mat folded under his arm, the tranquil smile, and the upward gaze before each prayer. People slowed their steps when they saw him. Some removed their shoes before approaching. Others watched from afar with silent respect. The constant noise of the bazaars softened whenever he knelt. Even the rickshaw drivers, impatient by nature, turned off their engines when they saw him lay down the mat. One day, a tea seller murmured quietly, "Before this place was noise and hurry, now it's where the heart breathes." His friend beside him replied, "And it all began because one old man didn't stop praying." With time, children began imitating him. Small, colorful mats appeared at doorsteps, and entire families made quick prayers at sunset. The streets grew calmer. People's eyes grew gentler. What had once been just a busy sidewalk had become a living reminder that faith can transform the space it touches. Abdul, however, refused any title. "I'm not the one the ground defended," he said simply. It was the name of Allah that did not allow injustice, and when someone called him the man the ground defended, he smiled, lowered his gaze, and changed the subject, as someone who knows that the true miracle never belongs to the man, but to the one who inspires him. Every afternoon, the same mat was spread on the same spot. The light breeze moved the fabric, and the sun gilded its edges. Passers-by stopped, waited for the prayer to end, and continued their path in silence, carrying with them a peace that could not be explained. That stretch of sidewalk was no longer just part of the city. It had become a reminder that even the ground recognizes when a heart speaks sincerely to the Creator. When the sun began setting over Lucknow, the sky turned shades of copper and pink. Old Abdul Rahim folded his mat carefully, as someone who concludes a sacred conversation. The golden dust of dusk floated in the air, and the gentle wind played with the white strands of his beard. He looked up and murmured softly, "Allah is just. Whoever tries to silence prayer awakens the ground itself." In the distance, the bells of a Hindu temple rang. Moments later, the adhan echoed from the mosque, the different sounds meeting in the air as a reminder that sincere faith always recognizes itself in any language or form. Some neighbors paused to watch him store his mat. Others simply smiled in quiet respect. And for a brief moment, everything seemed in perfect harmony. The wind, the dust, the sounds, and the hearts gathered there. Abdul walked away slowly, leaning on his cane. With each step, he left behind the same ground that had once trembled, now steady yet transformed. That part of the city was no longer ordinary. It was a living reminder that Allah sees, hears, and responds in the right time. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel and watch the next video, because there are signs that need no explanation, only a heart attentive enough to feel them.